A huge thank you to patron Russ Herb for suggesting today's video topic. If you want to suggest a topic for next Wednesday's Name Explain video, all you have to do is support Name Explain on Patreon for $1 a month. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/nameexplain, which will be linked down below. Anyway, the military forces that operate across the land have the resoundingly unique name of the Army. The military forces that operate across water also have the rather unique name of the Navy. And the military forces that operate in the air are simply called the Air Force. There's something a little wrong here. These are the three most well-known of arms of most armed forces found across the globe. And while two of these three branches get these fun, unique names, the third one, the Air Force, gets that pretty bland, generic, and to-the-point title of the Air Force. It would be like if the Army and Navy were called the Ground Force and the Sea Force respectively or something. So how exactly did this branch of our forces, the one that deals with defending people and places from the skies, end up with this rather generic name of Air Force, while the other two got those much more unique titles? Well, here's the thing. While the names of Army and Navy might sound somewhat more unique to us today, when these words first came into being, they were actually far more bland and generic to their initial speakers. Army and Navy are words with very old roots, and that's because we've had people fighting on land and at sea for millennia. According to the Guinness World Records, the first permanent army on the planet belonged to the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia and came into being around 2250 BC. Likewise, our earliest recorded evidence of a battle taking place at sea comes from the Hittites, a people who lived in modern Turkey, fighting the Alashians, who lived along the eastern Mediterranean. This happened in 1210 BC. This shows us just how long we've been duking out across land and sea with our armies and our navies. Though it's highly unlikely that the Hittites or the Akkadians were even calling them armies and navies, these go-to terms in the English-speaking world, as well as variations of them in other languages, derive from the language of the Romans, Latin. Army derives from the Latin word of armata, which means armed or equipped, and as a noun it simply meant armed men or soldiers. This became armée in Old French, and eventually armée in English. Navy likewise comes from the Latin navigia, which means a vessel or boat, and this comes from their word of navis, which just means ship. Once again, the Latin term became navire in French, which birthed navy as we know in English today. What this means is that despite how unique army and navy sound as words to us today, all they actually mean really is just soldiers and ships. Like I said, when these words first came into being, they would have been just as bland and generic to the Romans as Air Force sounds to us today. But centuries of language evolution has allowed them to become disconnected to our modern words of soldiers and ships, and resulted in them sounding way more unique to our modern ears. This shows us that the Army and Navy have a name just as bland as the Air Force. So why didn't the Romans give their Air Force a name that sounded dull to them too, which has since evolved to sound more unique to us? Well, you shouldn't really need me to explain that one to you. But just in case, obviously the Romans didn't have an air force of any kind. The technology to take fighting into the skies was something very much outside the reach of the Roman Empire. I mean, they could do a lot, don't get me wrong, in their time, but building airplanes was seemingly beyond their capabilities. I did actually check to see if by some chance Rome did actually have an air force of any kind, but the only things that came up were some Roman Empire themed Nike Air Force Ones and some custom Roman Reigns Air Force Ones too. Ones up to the tribal chief people. Go on, throw those ones up. We all need to see him up in the air. We need to acknowledge him, acknowledge our tribal chief, everyone. But yeah, Rome definitely didn't have an air force of any kind. In fact, there was literally no chance that Rome would ever have had an air force. And that's because the idea of fighting in the skies came way after the fall of the Roman Empire. Centuries after the fall of even Eastern Rome is when we got our first idea of air-based warfare. This wasn't with planes like we know today, but instead balloons. Yeah, people had the bright idea to use hot air balloons in war, with those people actually being the French. The French Aerostatic Corps came into being in 1794 and saw use in various battles during the War of the First Coalition. These balloons were primarily used for reconnaissance. People weren't firing bullets or dropping bombs from them seemingly. While this corps came into being in 1794, it was disbanded in just 1799. Clearly it wasn't the most successful of ventures for the French. If you're wondering why it was the French who military did this first? It seems to come down to the fact that hot air balloons are actually a French invention too. This is our first evidence of some kind of air force, and as we can see, it had a different name entirely. The name French Aerostatic Corps is simply the English translation of their French title, with that word of aerostatic simply meaning the study of objects through air. It's a really cool word, and this corps were also known as the Company of Aeronauts, which is also a seriously cool name. But seemingly, these names were abandoned when future attempts were made to take combat to the skies, and those future attempts would really come into being in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was in this time period which not only saw the increased use of airships, the far more advanced form of hot air balloons, and of course, airplanes finally came into being. The Wright brothers achieved their first sustained flight in 1903, and just 7 years later, in 1910, the world saw its first aviation-based forces come into being. Unsurprisingly, it was the French yet again who took the crown in all of this. This was the French aviation military, which was first founded as a sub-branch of the French army. It would of course eventually become its own independent thing in 1934. The first truly independent air force, however, came into being in 1918. This was none other than the Air Force of my own home nation, the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. It's here we see the first instance of that term Air Force being used in the name of a, well, Air Force, though we have evidence of this term being used a few years earlier. According to the OED, the first recorded instance of this term comes from 1911, and it's in relation to France having an Air Force. Man, the French just loved attacking people from the sky. Good for them, I guess. And also for context, the earliest evidence of army the OED gives us is from 1425, and the oldest evidence of navy comes from 1375, which shows us once again just how much newer a concept the Air Force is compared to these two. What this also shows us is that by the time the Royal Air Force came into existence, that term of Air Force was already being widely used to refer to a military that operates in the sky. Air Force is of course a simple combination of the words air and force, and we don't seem to know why exactly this combination of words were chosen to represent sky-based militaries. Force is a term which has long been linked with the military. Collectively, these are known as the armed forces, and once again, according to the OED, the term dates back to 1572. It makes sense why force would appear in this name. And likewise, air is a pretty logical word to tack onto forces here, as this is the branch of the armed forces which deals with air-based combat. But this title follows a very similar path that Army and Navy did when those words first came into being, as being a pretty generic title with a fairly to-the-point meaning. And this naming convention has actually been seen again. In more recent years, nations have added a new branch to their militaries, a branch which is to deal with space-based combat. This branch has simply been dubbed the Space Force, once again for pretty self-explanatory reasons. So while names like the Air Force and the Space Force might sound fairly unimaginative to us, in reality those names like Army and Navy were just as unimaginative to the Romans who coined them centuries ago. But let's have a little bit of fun here. Say if somehow the Romans were capable of making planes or some kind of flying machine and were able to set up an air force all that time ago, then what name would they have given it that we could use today as something a tad more unique than just Air Force? Well, how about we use the Latin word for flying as our basis? That seems like something the Romans would have done. Their word for flying is volans. This term could have evolved into something like volany or something in modern English to give us the trio of the army, navy and volany, which would have given all three of these armed forces more unique names. Well, to us anyway. Any Roman who would have seen this still would have thought they were pretty bland and boring. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and once again, thank you all so much.